2 minutes past 10, so I think we will get ourselves started. It looks like we have a good crew with us today, about just over 70 people. So thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Tina Neal. I'm the Executive Director of Risk Reduction and Public Education at the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. And I am here today to introduce the Provincial Disaster and Climate Risk and Resilience Assessment. I just see a few more folks coming in from the lobby, so I just want to make sure that we allow people time to come in. Okay. I'm really excited to share the results of, or I'm really excited to introduce and turn it over to the team to share the results of many years of hard work and collaboration that resulted in the Provincial Disaster and Climate Risk and Resilience Assessment and Hazard Insights tool. We have been working on this for quite some time, and this is an exciting opportunity to share this information and have it out into the world. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that I today am sitting on Songhees and Kasapsum First Nations territories, where I have been grateful to raise my family since 2008. The Risk and Resilience Assessment has been informed by work from across over 200 nations, spanning the 7 language families that exist here in what is now called the province of British Columbia. Since time immemorial, these nations have stewarded the lands and waters and have protected their diverse cultures, traditional practices, sciences, teachings, and oral histories. And we are so grateful and hold our hands up to the diversity of Indigenous expertise and leadership that they offer. We recognize our First Nations Committee on Disaster and Climate Risk, who I will introduce a little bit later, who collaborated on the assessment with us. I also want to acknowledge Alano Edzerza, who is the artist who created this beautiful template that we now use at Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. Alano is a Tahltan artist. He's from Tahltan territory. He's now based in Vancouver, and we commissioned this beautiful template for our presentations and for some of our other materials, and we're very grateful that his creativity and his beauty and his spirit is here with us as we communicate about what we do. Let's go to the next slide, please. So a little bit of housekeeping for us. During the presentation today, we have a question and answer function. So we would love for you to put your questions in there. Our team is going to monitor it all throughout the presentation. And the earlier we get the questions, the better chance that we have of answering the question while we're doing the presentation. We will also have a Q&A session at the end. Additional questions and comments, if something comes up for you or something that you want to tell us directly, you're welcome to email us at climatereadybc@gov.bc.ca. We have a team that monitors that all the time, and we will get back to you. The webinar will be recorded, and a copy of the presentation will be shared after the webinar. We also have a couple of other opportunities. Well, one opportunity coming up on February 5th. That webinar is directed or aimed at professionals, practitioners, and public sector organizations. You're welcome to join that one, or if you have a colleague or a friend who would like to attend, they are welcome to attend that webinar on February 5th. Otherwise, we will put the recording of one of our webinars up on our website. Next slide, please. We are very much aware that the material that we talk about in risk and resilience assessment and disaster-related things and climate change-related things can be heavy. And we understand that that can have an influence on our emotional well-being, and we want to ensure that folks are cared for and have the resources that they need to work through those feelings. So we are providing here resources and links to support services that can help. Next slide. So an overview of our agenda for today. We're going to run through the disaster and climate risk and resilience assessment that we have been working on since 2003. Well, actually, the work started before that. I'll get there. The context and its process, and the sample results. And we're also going to see an overview of all of the products and a demonstration of the new Hazard Insights tool. All of these materials are available on ClimateReadyBC, which will provide the website for you later. Next slide. There were many, many people who contributed to this work. You see a few of them here on the team. We had an internal team that was co-led by the staff in the risk assessment team at the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness, and the Climate Action Secretariat, which is now at the Ministry of Energy and Climate Solutions. GOBC was a very important and close partner for us. They are in the Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship, and we could not have done this work on our own. This collaboration was absolutely necessary. So I'd like to recognize the team that was involved in the work, and some members of each of these teams will be presenting the different parts of the webinar today. We're a small group presenting today, but we represent a very large group of people from across many provincial ministries, as well as a consulting team, partner organizations, and the First Nations Committee on Disaster and Climate Risk, who I will introduce to you on the next slide. We also had over 200 people participate in our project working groups and workshops. So we had voices from across the province, from different sectors, from different life experiences, and we are so grateful because this work is made stronger and richer by having all of that engagement and input. Let's move to the next slide. So we're really excited that throughout this process, we have worked with First Nations Committee on Disaster and Climate Risk. The members are listed here, and I believe a few of them are attending today, recognizing Trent, Lenore, Terry, and Tyrone. Thank you for joining us and for being here to witness the culmination of this work that we've been doing together for the last few years. The First Nations Committee was a really integral part of this work, and it's really hard to express how much we have learned as provincial public servants from the members of this committee. And I just want to just express how deeply grateful I am for them, for their ongoing support, all of the times when they've given us critical feedback, all of the times when they've helped us to learn and understand and connect what we do in the province, Western science, with the knowledge and the history and the lived experience of First Nations in this province. So, Heichka, I'm so grateful for all of your participation and your willingness to continue to partner with us. Let's move on to the next slide. So this work has quite a long history. It didn't just start in 2023 when we started this particular project. Provincial hazard and risk and vulnerability is something that the province has been looking at for over time, periodically. So the first time that the province conducted a provincial hazard, risk, and vulnerability assessment that we are aware of was back in 1997. We know that jumping forward a couple of decades into the 2000s, BC adopted the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. We had an Auditor General's report that talked about managing climate risks. We had the Chapman and Abbott review of the 2017 wildfire and flood season. And that spawned a greater awareness about the need to adapt to climate change and the need to be more proactive in our efforts to understand and manage disasters and climate risks. The climate preparedness we did a preliminary strategic climate risk assessment that was released in 2019, and that was followed by a climate preparedness and adaptation strategy that was released a few years later. that was really a pivotal moment for many of us working on this project, because we were also involved in that project then. And we learned that we had a lot of work to do to really understand disaster and climate risk from a whole of society perspective, and in particular, from a perspective that included reconciliation, consideration of intersectional disadvantage, and many other things that were historically left out or excluded from considerations of government. So we've been on a journey since about 2019 through our engagements, through our work with the First Nation Committee, and through really good advice that we have received from different people and consultants along the way. And that has what has led us here today. I want to recognize in particular a few individuals who were really instrumental at the beginning of this work around 2019. Denny Clement from Ktunaxa Nation. She was a consultant with us, and prior to that, an Indigenous youth intern who worked with us. And she gave us some really excellent early advice on the engagement and the process of undertaking risk assessments in a good way. I also want to recognize Jana Whale, who is from Gitxsan, for her work on seasonal rounds and her work with Brett Hewson, developing the Risk to Resilience report. Jana also spent some time with us as an Indigenous youth intern, and we're very grateful for all of the work that she has done and how her career has influenced our work. I also want to recognize Jenny Hemphill and the team at Sonala Planning. Jesse Hemphill. Jesse and the team have been with us along the way in a number of different contracts supporting this work, and guiding our approach to engagement, challenging us to do work in a good way, and bringing creativity and fun and also a trauma-informed approach to the work. So thank you so much to Jesse and the whole team at Sonala. This particular project that we're talking about today started in 2023 and was released last October 2025. And I think let's move on to the next slide so that I can tell you a little bit about how it got started and then pass it over to the team to get into some of the juicy details. So in government, we never do anything without being told. So the origin of this particular project was a mandate letter, and the mandate letters are written by the Premier to the minister of a ministry like EMCR, and it basically tells that minister what they need to deliver over the course of the mandate of that government. So our minister received a mandate letter in 2022 that said we need to develop a provincial hazard risk assessment. And later on in the 2025 mandate letter, it said we need to keep going and keep doing hazard risk assessments for the province and provide tools and information to inform community resilience, planning, and preparedness. Throughout this work, we have used the guiding pillars that you see on the right-hand side of the page. These pillars came from the many engagements that we've done since 2019 and have been informed by the First Nations Committee and supported by the First Nations Committee on Disaster and Climate Risk. So collaborating with First Nations, taking an equity-informed and strengths-based approach, upholding the best available knowledge, and supporting communities. This work came out of those mandate letters. It was also linked to the legislative requirements under the Climate Change Accountability Act to report out on climate risks every 5 years. That's something that the Minister of, I guess it's the Minister of Energy and Climate Solutions now. It was previously the Ministry of Environment, but that minister has to report into the legislature every 5 years on what government is doing to address climate risks. It is also informed by the Emergency and Disaster Management Act, which sets out new requirements for different regulated entities on how to do risk assessments in a good way. And so we were using this process as a way to understand and learn so that we can provide guidance to those regulated entities in the future. With that, I am pleased to turn it over to my colleague, Melissa, who is going to walk us through the next part of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Tina. Good morning, everyone. My name is Melissa, and I'm really honored to make my home on Lekwungen territory in Victoria. And before we dig in, we just want to take a moment to get a sense of who's on the call with us today. So we're going to pop a poll up and are just interested in what area of work you work in. I know many of you probably work in a few different areas. So feel free to put a few different answers into the poll here just for our awareness. I'm seeing lots of emergency management folks, lots in the planning space, public health, transportation, capacity building, health sector, Indigenous health, emergency response, fire department. Okay, great. Lots of folks with us today. Thank you so much. We'll give it another moment. Management office. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, great to see lots of different business areas represented here today. Wonderful. Okay, so we'll get the poll closed and we'll get into some details here. So Tina, thank you so much for laying all the context for us. And I'm just going to start off by giving a bit of an overview of the project, and then we'll get into some of the products. So as Tina mentioned, the Disaster and Climate Risk and Resilience Assessment is a provincial scale assessment, so quite high level, providing foundational information on risk and resilience across this place that we now call British Columbia. It's what we would call a systemic holistic assessment that uses both quantitative and qualitative methods, so a few different ways of bringing information in. And it was informed by both Western and Indigenous knowledge and sciences, and as Tina mentioned, by more than 200 subject matter experts, knowledge holders, and organizations that we worked with to bring the assessment together. So a little bit about what it does and also what it doesn't do. So it, again, provides foundational information on risk and resilience. It helps to add to a body of information and methodology that are reliable and consistent and publicly available, which was of particular interest and priority for this project. So this includes both how we understand and assess risk and resilience, as well as the information that we used. It provides findings across the whole province, which helps to inform a higher level or provincial scale planning. It also means that communities across the province can pull the information from the assessment and build on it for their specific goals and work. There's certainly a balance between information that is broad, but quite shallow, versus very narrow and deep and drilling down to maybe a specific location or a very specific risk. For this project, we prioritized wide and shallow. So the assessment findings do not replace more localized risk assessments and isn't meant to. And it's not really suitable for very detailed planning, for example, on a parcel level, if you're looking at a very specific location. And it also didn't assess all the hazards that we know exist across communities. So it really is intended to be a starting point to increase understanding of risk and resilience across the province and advance the practice of risk and resilience assessment. So what exactly did we assess and how? The DCRRA aimed to go beyond a typical risk assessment to consider how hazards impact a range of things that we care about. So the hazards you see on the left were assessed considering how they impact the value areas on the right. So we looked at two types of flood, extreme heat, drought and water scarcity, fire, earthquake, and a multi-hazard scenario. And these were assessed in the context of the built environment, natural environment, governance, economy, health and well-being, and society, cultures, and relationality. These value areas are inherently interconnected, of course, and certainly can't be considered individually, but they are a start in thinking about risk and resilience in different ways, and a first step towards making space for a range of different worldviews. So as Tina mentioned, we had so many people collaborate on this project, and this is a little bit of the working structure that we had. So we had working groups for each of those hazards and each of the value areas, which had representation from First Nations, Indigenous organizations, academia, practitioners, lots of different governments, and other experts. There were teams specifically focused on geospatial analysis, as well as equity, diversity, and inclusion. And all of the work set up through the First Nations Committee on Disaster and Climate Risk, who collaborated on both the process as well as the results. These are the key components of the DCRRA. So there are overviews of each of the hazards and values at the provincial scale. Scenarios were used to understand the hazards and their impacts on those value areas. Throughout the work, we integrated climate change's impact on risk. We included a quantitative geospatial analysis, which we'll show you a little bit of later, and also identified how hazards impact some groups more than others. I'm going to quickly walk through a sample of the results today, but as we have just limited time, we're not going to go through them in a comprehensive way, but really encourage everyone to look at the full results online. And also, if anyone would like to explore more detailed results, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll have that email address again for you later. So starting in the top left here, the assessment highlighted that we'll see an increase in the frequency and severity of climate-related risks across our communities, and I'm sure you have all experienced those impacts directly. Floods were identified as among the most common and costliest hazards in our province, with significant impacts to the built environment, economy, and food security. This has been in the news quite a lot recently. The earthquake scenario was a magnitude 9 quake, which is projected to have damages of around $128 billion. And that's the earthquake piece only, not including other hazards an earthquake might trigger, such as tsunami. And a brief insight from extreme heat. With a global warming level of 4 degrees Celsius, the likelihood of a 3-day extreme heat event is almost certain. Narrowing in on a few specific hazards, riverine floods are, of course, directly impacted by climate change, and the DCRRA confirmed and added to what we know about the vulnerability of people, infrastructure, and services. Other findings speak to the fact that First Nations have deep knowledge and relationships to areas impacted by floods, and know that floodplain areas are important ecosystems, and that First Nations people often place themselves strategically on the land to exist in relation to natural cycles, which ensured environmental protection, safety, social cohesion, and food security. We've included here examples of disproportionate impacts of riverine flood and the groups they impact. So for example, isolation and limited access to transportation to evacuate safely, which impacts rural and remote communities, including First Nations, older adults, and people with disabilities. And the chart in the corner shows findings from the geospatial exposure analysis that 2,700 critical facilities are exposed to riverine flood inundation. And the definition of critical facilities comes from BC assessment data. Over to extreme heat, which refers to prolonged periods of unusually high daytime and nighttime temperatures. Extreme heat impacts vulnerable populations most, including elders and those living in poverty, which we certainly saw in the 2021 heat dome. And extreme heat has regionally specific impacts to people and ecosystems. And from the exposure analysis, we see that the percentage of the population exposed to extreme heat today is 33%, and in 2050 will increase to 98%. And to earthquake, BC is at greatest risk in Canada of an earthquake. And in the event of a magnitude 9 quake, we'd see economic growth reduced to half, and we'd look at losing about 40,000 jobs over 10 years. And while climate change does not impact earthquakes themselves, it does increase the likelihood of an earthquake happening at the same time as another hazard. So for example, an earthquake occurring during wildfire season, which of course would stretch our response and recovery resources significantly. According to the exposure analysis, over 4 million people live in areas with seismic activity on top of 13,000 critical facilities. And we know that First Nations knowledge and stories tell the history of earthquake and are a potential source to inform risk and resilience. And I'm going to pass now to my colleague Tira to talk through some of the climate change results.
Thanks, Melissa. Good morning. My name is Tira Okamoto, is she, her pronouns, and I'm calling in from the Kwanghan Territory today. I'm a senior policy analyst with the BC Climate Action Secretariat, which is now part of the Ministry of Energy and Climate Solutions. We're happy to be partners on this project. And today I'll speak to two different kind of pieces of the DCRRA. First, the climate piece, and then disproportionate impacts. So you heard Melissa use the term global warming level a few slides earlier. When it comes to considering climate, there are multiple ways of approaching climate change projections. You can consider emission scenarios, time periods, or warming levels. And through analysis conducted by the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium, PCIC, the DCRRA used global warming levels for their analysis, and it offers clearer connections to the goals in the International Paris Agreement, and also reframes uncertainty away from just changes in emission levels towards the actual timing that the global warming level is likely to be reached. We chose this approach because the likelihood, severity, and frequency of climate change-induced impacts tends to scale with global warming levels, making it a useful tool for impact and risk assessments. Next slide, please. So in addition to those global warming levels, the DCRRA also considered climate change variables. And these variables help us consider the current and future impacts of climate change. These variables can also be hazard drivers, and a single driver or multiple drivers can lead to a hazard. So for example, temperature can be a single driver towards extreme heat, whereas both temperature and precipitation together are at play to drive wildfire. Taking these global warming levels and hazard drivers into account, and also looking towards the 2050s, BC is anticipated to experience warmer winters and fewer days below freezing, hotter summer days with more frequent heat waves, less rainfall and longer dry spells in the summer, more precipitation in the fall, winter, and spring, and increased severity of extreme precipitation and storm events. So lots of change on our landscape. Next slide, please. So the DCRRA also brought focus to disproportionate impacts. While we know that climate change affects everybody, these impacts are not felt evenly, with equity-deserving groups such as Indigenous peoples, low-income households, newcomers, older adults, people with chronic health conditions, and other groups facing heightened and disproportionate disaster and climate risks due to systemic inequities. For this chapter, we built on resources that exist already from within the province, First Nations, local governments, and other partners that document research both on the disproportionate impacts in BC and research that shares lived experiences from recent disasters. In the DCRRA, the Disproportionate Impacts chapter offers an overview of key definitions and important context. And it also highlights impacts across the 6 hazards that show representative examples or representative experiences felt by equity-deserving groups, such as the economic, transportation, and physical safety and health examples that were shown on the riverine and extreme heat results slides. Additionally, we're also grateful that the First Nations Committee on Disaster and Climate Risk reviewed this chapter, and we worked to ensure that their comments, knowledge, and insights were reflected. Next slide, please. Additionally, this chapter also offers guiding questions to support people in incorporating equity into risk assessments. I'll note here that these questions are broad and meant to prompt reflection and learning, drawing from an IGBA Plus model, and are distinct from the duty to consult for First Nations rights and title holders. This chapter offers a starting place for the work, and our teams are excited to keep deepening the analysis here, and we're excited to work with all of you on that. And I'll pass it to Yaron to review the DCRRA products.
Thank you, Tira. Hi, everyone. My name is Yaron Finzi. I'm policy analyst on the disaster risk assessment team. I'm happy to connect from Saanich territory where I live, and where I'm privileged to experience the land and live and work and bring up my kids. The DCRRA provided us with several resources. The 2 main documents are the full report, which is a technical report which describes the methodology, the full results by hazard and value chapters, and chapters about disproportionate impact and scenarios and case studies. There's also the hazard insight tool, which we will demonstrate in a few minutes. This is the geospatial interface map, online map that allows us to present the 6 hazards and their extent and the population, people, assets that are exposed to those hazards. Next slide, please. In addition, we provide 3 summary documents that are the executive summary, which is relatively short, and has some summary tables that are useful. The summary for policymakers, which is also useful for practitioners and decision makers, and the story map, which in a sense simplifies and presents the key insights, key findings in a more graphic and accessible way to the public. We use it a lot. It's very user-friendly. Next slide, please. The BC Hazard Insight tool, which we refer to as the HIT, as I mentioned, is the geospatial analysis web interface that in which we present the layers of the various hazards that we analyzed. In there, we present some new analysis, including future climate projections for extreme heat, drought, and coastal flood hazards. We allow overlying various layers that present population, assets, in ways that help gain insights about the hazard and exposure to these hazards. It is important to realize, and I think Melissa has mentioned it before, the analysis was tailored for the provincial scale. The data, the analysis methods, the presentation of the results are all tailored for that. The Hazard Insight tool allows you to explore that and also to download relevant data layers and summary reports. Next slide, please. Again, to clarify what we mean when we say that this Hazard Insight tool presents hazard exposure, we sort of think of risk as a combination of three main components: the hazards themselves, the exposure of people and the assets they value to these hazards, and the assessment of the vulnerability of these people and assets to these specific hazards. In this geospatial tool, in these maps, we present hazard exposure, which is the overlap of what is exposed to which hazards. Next slide, please. To do this, and I won't go into many technical details, and I think the demo in a few minutes, few seconds, will make things a little more clear and straightforward. But if you think of the top layer here representing the data inputs, the data that we gathered about the hazards, for example, floods, and their extent, their likelihood, and also the population and assets that we mentioned, some of which are like points on a map, some of which are lines of assets that we care for, let's say roads, electric wires, and all sorts of critical infrastructure, but also areas like parks or ecosystems that are also mapped. And by overlaying them on each other, we can count basically how many dots or lines or areas are within the hazard extent. And we can summarize that. And that's exactly what the geospatial analysis tool does. And it helps users and us too to get an insight on how many of these people and assets are exposed and what is the percentage of exposure and so on. And this data, as you'll soon see in the demonstration, is presented both on a provincial level and a regional district level. And to show you the beautiful demonstration, I'll pass the microphone to my colleague Trilby from GOBC.
Thanks, Ron. That's a great summary of the products of the DCRRA has resulted in. Hi, everyone. I'm Trilby Buck. I'm a Geospatial Services team lead on the Business Innovation and Emergency Response team at GOBC. I'm calling from Lekwungen Territory today. I'm going to take you through a demo of the BC Hazard Insights tool. From the homepage, there are two ways to access the applications. Through the dropdown, you see all 6 hazards, or you can click to Explore Hazards. And this jumps to the All Hazard Links section. The BC Hazard Insights tool shows the extent of each hazard and what could be impacted by them, such as infrastructure, people, the economy, the environment, and it brings all the data together in one reliable and authoritative place. Let's focus first on riverine flood. Each hazard links to its own interactive web page. Each page is organized into 3 sections: the information panel, the central map, and the infographics. On the right, the infographics provides a summary of exposures. This tool summarizes direct or indirect impacts across 5 value groups: population, businesses, critical facilities, transportation, and natural environment. Each widget is accompanied by an eye that provides a definition as well as a data source. Users can also click the hazard information button to understand the assets assessed for each hazard and hazard thresholds. Navigation tips will allow you to understand more thoroughly anything that's missed by my brief demo today in terms of how to get around the application. On the left, the information panel gives users the opportunity to understand the data, understand how to get started, and generate a summary report, which I will show shortly. I'd like to highlight under understanding the data, this view methodology. The methodology is grounded in spatial exposure and hazard analysis using systematic GIS workflows. This quantifies and visualizes areas where population and assets spatially intersect with hazard extents. This summary explains with graphics, including data sources, thresholds, and processes. Now, back to the map. The tool is designed to be used at a provincial and regional level and does not contain community or property level information. You can see when we zoom into the community or building level, we reach a zoom limit. Even though First Nations can use this tool to gain awareness, the data itself is not suitable for site-specific assessment. The tool can provide a lot of insights, but it is tailored for a larger scale. This is important to understand. Zooming down into the property level is irrelevant, misleading, and inappropriate. At the provincial level, this information can support broader decision-making and help prioritize action based on a pattern of hazard exposure across regions. For example, when considering infrastructure assessments, we can overlay population based on 2021 census data, exposure of vulnerable population based on 2016 social vulnerability data, overlay other hazards such as coastal flood or coastal flood future, or services such as communication lines or water supply. So right now, the application is filtered to all of the province, but what if I want to understand how these percentages would change based on a smaller area? I can click and it will filter based on the region that you select. Right now, statistics are summarized and filterable by regional district, and we're working with the First Peoples Council, the First Peoples Cultural Council, to be able to add summaries by First Nation language groups as well. We can immediately see that about 11% of the population falls within the flood exposure extent in this regional district. The tool shows roughly 14% of businesses are potentially exposed, representing 14% of annual revenue, which is important for understanding potential economic disruptions. For many sectors, this gives you a quick summary and a consistent starting point for mitigation planning or conversations with leadership. It's the first 10% of a place-based assessment done for you using standardized provincial data. From here, you can layer in studies, LiDAR model, on-the-ground knowledge, but the Hazard Insights tool ensures everyone starts from the same foundational information. I want to quickly highlight a powerful feature that you can find beside the hazard information button on the extreme heat and extreme heat future applications. This slider allows you to compare the future hazard extent directly between the baseline and the 2050 exposure layer. It shows in the infographics on the right, blue as the baseline and red as a projected future. And this is also currently filterable by regional district. Now let's imagine I want to bring this information to my lands manager for discussion about priorities on wildfire or flood mitigation. Other than screenshots, what are my options? Under Generate Summary in the information panel, you can click and fill out a form that pops up. You can specify the area and hazard that you're interested in, provide an email. Within 24 hours, delivered to your email will be a report. This report includes 3 things: the map with the hazard extent of the boundary of the interested region, all the exposure indicators within tabular format, and a glossary of the key terms used in the report. So instead of piecing together multiple data sets or screenshots, you get one standardized package. The goal here is simple: create a shareable, evidence-based understanding of the hazard and what's at stake. All of the hazard and exposure layers behind this tool are published as authoritative provincial services. You can download them or pull them straight into an ArcGIS Online environment or desktop GIS through the data download page. This gives you a provincial single source of exposure information and the ability to customize it with your own data sets to support planning, risk assessment, or emergency exercises. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Melissa, who's going to talk more about linkages and next steps. Thank you.
Thanks, Trilby. I'm going to share my screen again here. Okay. So yeah, we're just going to quickly go through some learnings and some next steps. I'm going to try and make this quick so we have a bit more time for questions here. So yeah, we wanted to share a little bit about some of the things that we've learned over this project and continue to learn. The first is about the nature of risk and resilience assessments. So we know that at their core, these assessments are Western processes and values-based exercises. We care that something is at risk because we value it, whether that be our buildings, food, health, or our relationships. And we look to other important work that's underway to think about ways to bridge the gap between Western risk assessment practice and Indigenous alternatives. And Tina mentioned Jana Whale and Brett Hewson, and we're really looking forward to learning from future work from them and other leaders and thinkers in this space to really understand good ways forward to bridge that gap. Typical risk assessments focus on structures and critical infrastructure, which is of course important. And we also know we need to explore ways to bring different worldviews and things that we value into these processes. And again, learning from other work that's underway. We learned and knew and continue to learn that different sources of knowledge, especially knowledge that's been ground truthed and comes from years of experience, is essential to understanding the complexity of risk and how to build resilience in different contexts. And for that knowledge to be shared openly and with trust, relationships must be built. And we look also to important principles like OCAP. We were reminded of the importance of safe spaces for working together, and how to do this well is a priority to keep learning about. And so with the First Nations Committee, we're working on resources to share out some principles, recommendations, and best practices from what we've learned and continue to learn. And of course, the concept of nothing about us without us, that First Nations people must be the ones to share your experiences of risk and resilience. This learning here at the top came from, again, trying to approach risk assessment in a new way. There are folks on the call with us that participated in this project and know that sometimes it was messy, didn't always go according to plan. And a key learning was to ensure that we try to meet people where they are at, and do our best, and adjust along the way. We are also reminded not to reinvent the wheel, but to build on knowledge and relationships that already exist and have existed for a really long time, which is especially important when resources are scarce. We want the DCRRA to be used by practitioners and communities and partners, and that starts with both the methodology, so how to approach this work, and there's information on all of these different methodologies included in the report. On the context side, we spent a lot of time deciding on definitions and key guiding concepts for this project, many of which we'll continue to use in future work. And then data science and knowledge. There's a lot of existing and new information and data out of this project, such as the HIT, which you've seen now. Another thing I wanted to flag was the First Nations Committee developed First Nations definitions and understandings of all the hazards and values And we'd really like those to be shared out and reflected on. We have an updated climate overview with a lot of new climate science, disproportionate impacts of each hazard, and lots of other information. And so we're really hoping that these resources can be used both as a reference and a building block for lots of other work. And again, if you have any questions or interest in understanding any of these components better, please do reach out to our team. Just a quick nod to some of the linkages to this work. So all this work is hosted on the ClimateReadyBC platform, which has a lot of other resources there, and you can find the links to that in the Q&A pinned. And then also funding programs, just a quick nod to some of the programs that exist to get funding for related work. And again, just mentioning Prepared BC as a great resource. And just very briefly, where we're going next with this work. To build on the DCRRA, we're working on guidance and tools for completing risk assessments. We're going to continue to build out some of the resources from the DCRRA, for example, the Hazard Insights tool, adding more data and analysis. For example, we're looking at summaries not only by regional district, but also by First Nations language group. And lastly, we're exploring how to address regional needs. So some of you might be aware that we had initially planned to follow this provincial scale assessment with a series of high-level regional risk and resilience assessments. However, from the DCRRA, learnings from the DCRRA, feedback from communities, and the fiscal situation has prompted us to shift approaches and instead look at ways to support more detailed risk assessment work, such as data and partnerships for communities. And that's something that we're just starting conversations around what that will look like. So with that, I'll bring our presentation to a close. And thank you so much for joining us today. Again, the materials and resources mentioned are pinned in the Q&A, and you can also find all of them by using this QR code.